Hey everyone, thank you guys for making it to here today, by the way, because it is soaking. I'd like to welcome you to this Introduction to Flutter event. This is probably going to be one of our last events, if not the last event of the year. And to commemorate that, I brought here with me John Manning. So he's a Google developer expert. So he's an expert recognized by Google. So I think this is a really great opportunity for y'all to learn, I guess, a lot about Flutter, and I guess another thing to add, like, just a person who is actually officially recognized by Google. So yeah, I'm not going to take any more time away from you. So you can introduce yourself, and yeah, go right ahead.
Awesome. Thank you. And for those that are on virtually, I know it's super raining. Thanks for joining us remote. Thanks for those of you that are here in person as well. I'd like this to be as low key as I can. So if you have questions here in the chat, or like here, just ask, because this is for you. This isn't for me. Same thing for those that are in the chat. If you have questions, just raise your hand. We're going to record this. We'll have this up officially on YouTube later for those who want to be able to review this stuff as well. And all the code that we have here is open source, MIT license that you can work with. So here's our slides. That's my contact info. My name is John Manning. Actually, I did not go to the University of Maryland, but interestingly, over a decade ago, University of Maryland shaped my career path. Because I was a fourth year medical student here doing some work at the NIH, and we learned from University of Maryland's Human Computer Interaction Lab really cool stuff from Ben Schneiderman, Catherine Plaisant, and I essentially put Lifelines 2 as a use case within the NIH record system. And that's where I learned about usability, which then turned into human computer interaction and human factors. And that's what I do today. So as a physician, we always start with disclosures. Those are my titles. So I'm CEO of a company called MayJuun, where we build healthcare-focused apps where user interfaces match the workflow, which we are missing a lot of in medicine. And I also practice clinically at Atrium Health in Charlotte, North Carolina. I worked in emergency medicine department last night. We did a lot of yesterday morning, sorry. We did a lot of resuscitations and we cared for patients. I also teach there as well. So a lot of what I'm wearing today is from the MayJuun hat. Our primary goal is building digital solutions that advance health and well-being, where interactions mirror your workflow. We do have a lot of background in medical practice and usability, as well as global health and state-based Medicaid organizations. And I'm the GDE that's a part of MayJuun. We also have DevOps engineers and experts in the healthcare standard for data exchange called FHIR. We built things to date that are in the pre-hospital. So EMTs, medics, paramedics use this. This is an open source application that is used in Virginia to find your guidelines without even having to connect to the internet. This uses Firebase and Cloud Firestore for emergency medicine physicians when they're on shift. And we're more known for the stuff that we built in social care to screen for social need in any language of any type of question. That's what we do, all healthcare focused. I love this image because it's been around for 4 years and I have it in most of my Flutter talks. It's wonderful. Dart is wonderful. Flutter is wonderful. For those that are super beginner level and have not heard about Flutter, it is Google's open source user interface toolkit that you can build an application for any screen. And by any screen, we mean, so Android, iOS, web, Mac, PC, and Linux. So started with Android and iOS, then expanded into web, and then it went into desktop platforms as well. It's all over the place now. It's in the New York Times app. It's in Toyota's cars, the BMW app. It's over 700,000 apps have been published using Flutter. And I'm sure they're going to announce that later this month at I/O, what the most updated number is. We'll see. It's the third largest repository on GitHub by contributors. And people who develop in it love it because it's wonderful to develop stuff in. And there's a lot of different ways that you can learn. So some people like videos, some people like actually watching, like reading the documents. Some people like code labs, Personally, for me, it was a mixture of videos as well as just diving right into the documents and seeing what other people were also writing as well. And that's how I learned. I use this slide a lot, both for healthcare and for Flutter things, the concept of building upon the shoulders of others. The nice thing about Flutter in particular is it's a declarative language rather than imperative, and it's completely open source. And so by declarative, think about it as go to the store and get some milk. That's my declaration. And it shows up and there's some milk and you're done. That's the response. Imperative would be, I have to park, I have to go to get a shopping cart, I have to go to aisle 7, I have to grab the milk, I have to go to the line. You have to name every single step. You don't need to worry about that in Flutter. And just like how people can drive a car without having to know about spark plugs and piston engines and all of that, this is the benefit of Flutter as well. So getting started, looking through what would be interesting for you all. So the University of Maryland app, I figured let's see what we can do at least to recreate some of those layouts together while talking through some of the basics in Flutter. So hello world, how to get started from the very beginning, why hot reload is cool, widgets, and at least some basics about setting up a theme. And if we have time, we'll go into a little bit of folder structure. I'll give some recommended architecture. We'll do, I'll just say the benefits of generators and code generation and why that can help you today so that you don't have to do a lot of boilerplate. And we'll just get right into it. So flutter.dev, if this is your first time going to here, what I would suggest strongly is the get started and follow what your installation steps are to get it installed, where it's not worth talking about today. There's lots of YouTube videos that walk you through this. I even had a 5-step like Fish and Flutter blog post where I showed what we do for Mac products to get Fish, the like the user-friendly shell, as well as iTerm. So you'll see me use that as well. But in docs.flutter.dev, if you go to user interface, the intro to widgets and the widget catalog and this first part of like layouts in Flutter, I think are the highest yield first things to look through. And in Flutter, everything is a widget. And I used to visually show this, but I think the picture is sometimes a little bit better where everything is essentially a hierarchy, and they'll show you how you are able to create that essentially from scratch and, you know, working with rows and columns, and you can actually see what it is that they're working with. And then if you want to get like the absolute basics, go to this widget catalog and click where it says basics, and it will tell you, you know, app bar is the thing at the very top. Scaffold is basically a new Flutter screen, it's particularly on mobile. And if you click into this, or if you ever search at the very top, it'll give you code examples. You can click run, and it'll actually just show you a working app embedded directly, which is really cool. It's for this Hello World application. And then it'll talk about all the other things like app bars and, you know, navigation drawers and bottom app bars and all that stuff. So this is very, very, very high yield if you were just getting started. What I like to do, and I'm going to go into iTerm using Z shell, and I'm just gonna, let's just do Flutter create. And this is the benefit of Z shell, is it automatically lets me type in all the things that I've done most recently, and it remembers that, and you can search through it. But if you don't want your application to be just com.example, I would set your organization at the beginning, and then whatever you call this at the beginning will essentially create the packages with the app names for Android and iOS, Maryland. And then if you do code dot, then you can essentially go into here, and now we have the Flutter application with all the bells and whistles for whatever style that we want. So I'm gonna go ahead and in VSCode, I use a lot of keyboard shortcuts, and I'll try and walk through some of them without being overwhelming, but Command-Shift-P on a Mac is absolutely wonderful. It's a very fast way to get stuff up and running. And the benefit of all of that is that essentially what I can do is just click, I'll do a create a launch.json file. which creates all this fun stuff for me. If I want to go into the regular old mode that I need, I can just select this here. And if I have multiple devices running, down at the very bottom right is where I select my device specifically. So let's see if we can get this Hello World part up and running. While we're doing this, just for the very, very beginning, what I like to do is, if you're creating an application for Hello World, it'll have a lot of commented code in main.dart. And it's really hard to read if you're trying to show this in a live coding environment. So in VS Code, I'll just press Command-Shift-L, which selects all of this text, and delete it. And I'm going to do the exact same thing for pubspec.yaml. So anything with this, Command-Shift-L, and then I'm going to select all the text that's there. And here we go. Now I have a much cleaner version of both pubspec and also my main.dart. And let's see if this also works. There we go, and that's it. Very fast way to get a just very basic application started from scratch. If you've done anything in Flutter, you've probably seen this application before in main.dart. One of the things that's really cool about it is this concept of hot reload. So if I say change my colors from blue to red, I can do that. If I want to change it to orange, I can do that as well. And it keeps state, so I have 5 times pressed, and it just has it right then and there. That's super useful. One thing a lot of people don't know, and I have this in the GitHub repository for here, where I'm going to tell you exactly what settings that I have in VS Code, as well as these extensions. And if you all want, I can do multi-device and put multi-device debugging in there as well. But there's a way that you can launch Flutter in all platforms at once if your laptop can support it. So if you search for multi-device debugging, this is actually from GitHub on Flutter. And it basically says, get all this stuff in your configuration. And then you can put multiple configurations together, so they'll essentially do this in real time. So what that means actually in code is under launch.json, which was just now created. What I'm going to do is, instead of all this fun stuff with uMarilyn profile and release, and I could include it if I wanted to, I'm going to just copy the Android and iPhone part for these device IDs. And I can, in my terminal or command prompt or whatever you have, just run Flutter devices. And essentially what that will do is allow me to, let's do 2 more of these. So Android device, my Android device, oh, I don't have my emulator running. Hang on, launch Pixel. And then we'll run this again. Flutter devices. Here's my Android emulator on the right. Here's my iOS emulator on the left. My Android emulator is that ID. My iOS ID is here. This will say is Mac OS, and it's called just Mac OS. And this one will say is Chrome, and its device ID is Chrome. And you can find them right here. This is Mac OS, and this is Chrome. That's where I'm getting it. And then what I'll also add is this for Mac OS and for Chrome. And so now, and let's just make it look a little bit prettier, right? There we go. Now, if I select under this part, I have under Play, Android, iPhone, Mac OS, Chrome, and now all devices. And if I click all devices, what should happen is I should get the same application running 4 times on one machine, so that I can see this update for Android, iOS, web, Mac, and Chrome.
How do you check if you have the processing power?
I can do this with older version Mac before the M1 and M2 architecture. If you have an M1, you can probably do it. Good question. So the question was, how do you check and see which devices you can actually run for this? So we'll make this just a little bit smaller. Here's Chrome. Here's iOS, and here's Android. And if I click a few of these and a few of these, and let's do 5 or 6 for this one, and just 1 here. If I go into my main.dart and I change the colors from orange to green, you'll see this update for all of them. Now keep in mind, if you're ever doing development in Chrome, it's always a hot restart whenever you press save. So you do not keep state right now in its current state, but all of the other ones have retained state. That's really, really useful. And of course, you can change these colors however you want, and you can make things look a little bit cleaner, and you can do whatever you want from this part. For your eyes, I'm only going to do this on the iOS device here on the far left, but if you have multiple monitors to work with, this can be really good, especially if you're doing Android and iOS at the same time. You cannot do Android and iOS at the same time for a Linux or a Windows environment. That is exclusive to Mac, because you can't run a Mac emulator easily. If you can run it, then it's fine. So let's open it up over here. I'm going to close this, and we're essentially going to work within main.dart, but we're going to make this a little bit easier too. So shortcut 1 is multi-device when relevant. Shortcut 2 that I'm going to give you is essentially this concept of right here, and I also have this in the, where's this at? Essentially within VSCode, if you're using VSCode, this CodeActionsOnSave, setting that to true. And the way that you get to that is on VSCode, it's command comma, and I think you just search for CodeActionsOnSave. And it'll say edit this in settings.json, and all you have to do is add this right here. What that does, and it's easier to show if I set it to false. You see how this says const, because it's only accepting text, and it will have everything as, essentially it's much cleaner to use const if the constructor is just using simple text, or like, it's a huge performance boost. Let's just leave it at that. I have a suggestion within my emulator that says I should be doing this. And whenever I hit save, the suggestion is still there. Let's say I had a duplicate import. The suggestion is to remove it. If I set fix all to true, and I hit save here, it will make all of those changes whenever I press save. And so whenever you're working with a whole bunch of imports, that's really important, because it just speeds you up very quickly. That's part number 2. Part number 3 is just, these are the extensions that I use. Feel free to add them, feel free to look through them, but there are ways that you can speed yourself up very quickly within VS Code. So with all of this in mind, what I'm going to do within main.dart is I'm going to essentially take the counter application, which is everything from here down, and bring this out into its own class. I'm going to rename this class with Command-Shift-L to counter view, just so that I have it so I don't delete everything. And what I'm going to do right here is essentially, the question sometimes is, what is the bare minimum that you need for an application to run? And the answer is, for a bare bones application, you don't even need MaterialApp, but you could do this with, you essentially need my app into MaterialApp into something. And I'll just wrap this with a center so that you can see this. This looks terrible. It doesn't look great, but it runs. So you don't need the theme, you don't need the title. All you need is in the main.dart, run app, and then you need MaterialApp somewhere, and that's about it. If I was to put this inside of a scaffold and make this as part of the body, then you could see that it's very hard to read the actual text, but that is the next level up, thinking of the scaffold as being essentially that next screen. And if you want it to actually look like an actual application, then I can make this where it also has an app bar at the top. If you're ever working with VS Code or any of the code formatters where it'll automatically modify your text, if you just add commas, it'll change how things look. if you find that that's a little bit easier for you to read. So that's something that's helpful. And then if you think within a text, you can hover into this and change your style and change the size of the text, and you can do all sorts of other stuff. The way I used to teach this before we had a lot of the newer usability enhancements was essentially I can set my own text style right here. I can set my font size. I can set my color. So we can set this to colors.green, sure. And you'll see all this stuff update. It is much cleaner to instead use theme data. And there's H1, H2, H3 has essentially been replaced with headline medium, headline large, headline small. There's ways that you can look up and see exactly what size that will be. And of course, you can set that to your own. But realistically, the benefit of having themes at the very beginning and extracting that out makes it so that you can make this exactly how you'd like. So that's kind of that next step up so that I don't have to use text style where I'm setting every single thing by hand. Instead, I would do something like theme.of context, which is a very common pattern that you'll see where it actually goes up higher in the widget tree and says, where's my most recent theme? If I don't have one that's set, it has a default. And then I can go to text theme and find all this stuff that I'm talking about. So if I want it to look like headline large, I can do that, or headline medium. You'll see it update in real time, headline small. And instead of doing this individually for every single text widget, just set it in your theme. You can set the content for your text theme. So that's, again, we're thinking very, very basic parts of your Flutter application. Hello world, the benefit of hot reload, the fact that a widget is inside a widget, and the theme. Any questions on that part before we start to make something look pretty? No. All right, now comes the fun part, and we'll see how much I can get through. So what I like to do, just trying to think through this and just looking at this as a whole, is first off, I'm already here. One thing that I would suggest is if you've got your actual theme and you know exactly what color you want this to be, primary swatch is actually, you can actually pull different colors directly from, so here's a good example. So if I went into the University of Maryland app and I see this color and I want to know exactly what color that is, I can actually inspect that widget and see what that color is and update this colors application, 0xFF, and then whatever that actual, what is that, E21833? E21833. So this is exactly that color that is in the University of Maryland. That's your color scheme. And instead of a swatch, what is essentially newer is, what was it? Seed color. CodeActionSoNSave is a nice, easier way that you can essentially get everything like that. And then it'll adjust like your containers and some of the other things that are related to this to make your life a little bit easier. You can go way in depth on the theme. Right now, all I want to do is essentially give you something for light mode and something for dark mode. So essentially, I can make this where it essentially looks the same based on if it's in light mode or dark mode. That's it. I don't want to do anything else with this. The second thing that I would like to at least cover, and I know I'm covering a lot, but I want to put this into different folders so that you can see what your architecture could be like. There's different types of patterns, but just to make your life a little bit easier, and then we'll start doing some code generation and start putting those widgets together. So what we have in ours, and we essentially is a modification of the MVCS pattern, but I have this all in GitHub where it tells you, we essentially have a source repo, a source folder, and then features and UI. And that's all I'm going to cover right now. If we have time, I'll show you widget book, but mostly just features and UI. So in features, let's just create this folder. Oh. The one thing that we used to do is whenever we were creating new folders, we would put all of the UI elements in one folder. And we would put all of the insert state management system here in one folder. And then we would put all of the utility elements in one folder. And what it turns into is it becomes really difficult to actually figure out exactly which thing is connected to where, and it's all over the place. So if instead you have a folder structure that's essentially, we'll say for features, I only have two big user interface widgets, right? I've got the main screen and I have the counter screen. That's it. Then it becomes a lot easier to get from one element to the other. And you can have each of these essentially in their own class, and you can have them all get imported at the very top, and that's totally fine. But another thing that we realized as we were doing this is it's real painful to have to import every single thing every single time over and over and over again, and frankly, you don't need to do that all the time. So instead of counter, I'm changing this to counter.view or counter_view, and anything that's related to here, I'll just put under this counter that matches this. Same thing. So features is going to export to counter/counter. And that way, anything that's getting exported from this folder will work its way up. And then the same thing for source. Features.dart. And that way, if I'm just importing, I'm like anywhere in the widget tree, all I have to do is import source, and I can get to any one of them. And so many things you want to have as private classes. This is a nice way to make it so you don't have to manually import things over and over again. Quality of life, you could argue if it's useful or not. So let's essentially take this main.dart. We don't need any of this stuff right now that's in home. I'll extract that later. And instead, we'll do counter view, and we'll do title of counter. And so this should go back to what we were used to, where it says you push this button however many times. If I make it in dark mode, you can actually see how that looks on one side versus the other, and you can see this all gets updated. So within counter, just to give you the high-level overview, you've got two types of widgets in Flutter. You have stateful widgets, and then you have stateless widgets. Stateful widgets are the things that you use that keep state in that one spot, and there are many, many, many use cases to do that. Stateless widgets, it's literally everything else because it's very clean, it's fast, and you can do, they're all over the place. I'll say that incrementing and having set state, and every time you call set state all over your application, which triggers a redraw for everything, is painful. And, we've used many different state management tools. I will just say Riverpod with code completion is a huge lifesaver. And I'm going to just show you that quickly because my goal always is as little effort as I need to with a lot of automation on the back end. And so here again, Command-Shift-P, I'm going to add a dependency for Riverpod. I'm going to add it for, instead of Riverpod, we're going to do hooks Riverpod, add dependency hooks Riverpod, and I'll tell you why here in a minute. I'm going to add a dependency for Riverpod annotation, and then I'm going to add a dev dependency for Riverpod generator. And the last is a dev dependency for build runner. Now, again, 4 steps. Looks painful. I had to add all these extra things. Why did I even bother with this? So Riverpod and annotation allows me to essentially make my state look like a class. I'll talk about hooks later. Build runner allows me to, in terminal, do Flutter pub run build runner. And since I have this wonderful extension for build runner in VS Code, just press Command-Shift-B and not even have to remember that. So I'm not even leaving VS Code to do my code generation, or if I'm doing a whole bunch of stuff, I can just click this button and every time I hit save, it'll rechange and rebuild everything that I need to do. Super useful. So instead of counter view, this hello world application that everybody's seen hopefully a million times if you've gone through anything with Flutter, instead of all of this, I don't need it anymore. And once again, I'm going to use a shortcut. So I'm going to use stateless consumer widget, and I'll talk about consumer. I'm going to call this counter view. This needs me to import hooks Riverpod, and from here all the way down to here, I'm just going to delete it. So I essentially just have one build method. I'm not passing in a title anymore, so I'm just going to manually do this and get rid of this error so that that goes away. So now I'm down to just my errors in here. And so consumers are the things that will essentially read these references within Riverpod to figure out what is happening. If you're ever working with Riverpod, you have to make sure that your MaterialApp has this thing called ProviderScope, so that anything below it can actually look through and watch these changes. And if you look at it, all I've gotten rid of is I don't have the ability to add to my counter, and I don't know what the counter actually is. That's my problem right now. So within my feature, I'm going to create a new file called counter providers. I'm going to put this into here as well, just while I'm at it. Again, a lot of this is doing all the work for me. And I'm going to use Riverpod class as a snippet and just call this counter. And this is going to want me to bring in Riverpod annotation, and it's going to, I use a thing called part. So this is what Build Runner will create, and this is all I have to care about. So counter just takes an integer, and I'm going to start it at 0, and we're just going to run the Build Runner. The overarching theme with code generation is that I set up something that is human readable for me, and all that other stuff I don't have to worry about. And it takes a little bit of time for this to get built, and it'll create a counterproviders.g class with all of this that's here. And essentially in this place, I will now have something that can be watched, and whenever it changes, I can work from there. If you're working in Dart class and you only have one line, one other thing you can do is convert this to an expression body just to make things a little bit smoother. And I'm going to make a new method within my counter class for increment, which takes no parameters. And it's essentially going to take state is equal to state plus 1, but this is, you know, we're in a modern 2023 language. We're going to just do state plus plus. And while we're at it, we're going to decrement, and we're going to make that to state minus minus. So with all of this in mind, now what I have to do in here is essentially final counter is equal to ref.watch and Riverpod, that's counter provider. And this will no longer be a private variable. And this one, I'm just going to say, I'm going to set it to nothing right now just so that you can see it. I'm going to hot restart everything. It's going to be really mad at me probably just for 1 second. And then it says I pushed the button 0 times. Okay. So I have, this is now tied to my state management class. What I'm going to do at this point is essentially do ref.read instead of watch whenever you're doing an asynchronous thing. So like when you press a button, it's read, it's not watch. Everything else is watch. And then I'm going to do the counter provider. And then the only thing you have to remember is .notifier if you want to make a change. And this will be increment. So what I've essentially done is created a new way to go up. And you know what, while I'm at it, we can just go ahead and create a new way to go down as well. So let's wrap this in a column. If I make this, if I hit save, my button goes all the way to the top, and that's not great. So I need to make this small. Here we go. So it should go back to the bottom. And then below here, I'm going to make one that's called decrement. And it will decrease, and it will be a different icon. So if you look, this goes down, this goes up. And that was very minimal in terms of lines of code and things that you have to read. If you want things to look pretty, I'll just tell you a dependency called gap is super nice because all I have to do is say gap of, I don't know, 12 and import it. And then it'll put this for 12. If I wanted this at like 24, I can get this much higher. Oh, come on. There we go. But there's essentially nice ways that you can make click user interface changes just while you're writing the code. You press save, you move on. Yeah. Yeah.
Share the same state, for example, if you know, like press plus on one and press plus another one.
Excellent question. If you have multiple versions of this counter, will it share the same state? And the answer is yes. And the cleanest way for me to do this, because if you look in build, it's redoing the entire scaffold. It actually would make a lot more sense for me to only have this text watch that counter. And then I could put the other part that's watching counter anywhere else in this application. And it's much cleaner code. There is a way that you can have different instances of counter, which is the next logical thought. And if I pass a variable within the build method, it will essentially, so if I say like this one takes string of cool, and the other one takes like a different string or something along those lines, so I'll say ID, you have to pass an ID into it, and then you can have different instances of this. So that's a nice way that you can actually work with different iterations of the same state management tool without having to figure out in Riverpod, am I using a future provider? Am I using a stream provider? Am I using async? Any of that. You don't have to care because the generator will figure that out for you. So this is a huge shift from the way Riverpod used to be. I highly recommend it if you're getting started because it's much easier to read. So it's a wonderful tool. Any other questions on the counter before I move on to building the next part? Okay. So these are good questions. And if somebody has questions in the chat, please feel free. I'll try to answer them as best I can, but others that are here, please just let me know if I'm not actively watching. So the same thing, I'm going to do main view.dart. I'm going to export this .dart. And I'm actually, you know what? I liked how this looked so well. I'm going to just copy that rather than use my old version of main. And import hooks Riverpod. Sure. Let's import material. And I don't need counter provider. I don't need any of this other stuff that's down here. Let's say txt. Let's just get us some random text. And I don't really care about any of this column. That's part of my floating action button. So let's just get rid of all that, and we'll call this home. And you know what, while we're at it, so we're at University of Maryland, home view. Oh, I don't have this in source. Let's go to features, export home/home. I'm sorry, this is called main. That's why it's not working. And let's call this should actually, you know what, I like home. Home is probably a better title for this. Home/that and home view, and we're going to call this home. That way there won't be any confusion about me actually doing whatever main is this main.dart, and then this is going to be the home view. So that should work, and let's see what else is breaking. This needs to be called home view, and that should have everything working. Okay. So once again, all the stuff that's happening at the top, it's actually automatically importing this stuff for me. If I ever wanted to, I could always set this myself, so I don't even have to import the package. This text is way too difficult to read. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to, yeah, well, it's fine. Let's just keep it as is. So here we essentially have a blank slate to build from. What I'm looking to build is this. And when you think about it, what I have is an image and then some stuff that scrolls. And then at the bottom, there's a bottom, what is the term? Navigation bar, or bottom navigation widget. So let's start with the image first, because that's probably going to be the easiest. And what we do for that, again, I'm doing a little bit of a whirlwind because I want to get this done as well as we can. All the code is available. As you have questions, please ask. But I was messing around with MayJuun and made just essentially said, hey, give me a turtle that is a statue. And it gave me this cute little asset that I'm going to import into my application. And so benefit of this is here's my turtle statue. It may look a little bit familiar. Okay, cool. All right, awesome. So in the pubspec.yaml, what you have to do is you have to do an asset import. And what that looks like is literally just under Flutter at the very bottom, assets, tab, and then whatever the folder this is called. So if I had this under assets/images, I would also have to do one for images, or I could do the individual file if I wanted to do that, but I like making this as easy as possible. So within home view, instead of this body, I'm actually going to just so that you can see how I can do this, I'm going to make a stateless consumer widget called body. And I'm going to just reference that below. And I'm pulling this out to the point that you were having earlier about when do I do the redraw? Does it make sense to do this for all of the widgets or just for small, like a few of them? So whenever this redraws, it's not going to redraw the entire scaffold and app bar and everything that's below it. So it's technically a little bit cleaner. And if I'm putting this in multiple widgets or if it's getting shared, I'm not going to make it private. But that underscore is what makes things private within Flutter. So here, if I hit save, everything has gone away. What I'm going to do is a column. Inside the column, I'm going to have children. In that, I'm going to have an image from an asset, and I'm going to just right-click and say copy relative path and put that into here. And then I'm going to put a little bit of text just below there as well. And you could probably just barely see the text that's there, but you can see there's multiples below. So we have a cute little turtle. That's great. While we're at this, following that same general idea, what I'm going to do is a bottom, let's see, navigation bar. And if you ever working in VSCode, and you can do this with the Android Studio as well, when you peek and put the mouse over whatever that area is, it'll tell you what it takes. So this takes a widget. It doesn't have to. App bar only takes a preferred size widget, and app bar extends preferred size widgets, and it can even tell you all the stuff that it takes. So if you're not even going all the way into the Flutter docs, there are ways that you can essentially find what other stuff can be accepted so that you can just build it from there. So what I want to do here is I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to do a stateless consumer widget. I'm going to call this bottom nav, and this will essentially do bottom nav. And inside of here, I know that I want to do a bottom navigation bar. And now if I press save and I put something in here, it's going to break my application. And the reason why it breaks it is because I have to have at least 2 items and they have to have some labels. And if I don't have that, everything breaks. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Bottom navigation bar item. It takes an icon, which is actually a widget. So it's going to be an icon widget with icon stat, sure, cabin. So if I have these 2 things and I hit restart, it's going to give me another error, which says every item must have a non-null label. So I'm going to add a label, which takes a string, and I'll call this label. And same thing, which takes a string. We'll say label 1 and label 2. And I'm going to do a hot restart so I don't have to click through all that. Here's label 1, here's label 2, and let's just do a third label as well. So here are my bottom navigation bar items. If you look through kind of like how this actually is, and if you're actually looking at the application that we're mirroring for a purpose to show you how stuff like this can be built. The first one is essentially home. The second one is a SMS outlined, and this is what we're looking at: home, SMS, and this one. So it's home, messages, and menu. Messages, and the last one is menu. And let's adjust that one to apps outlined. Okay. One last bit to actually turn this part back on. You already saw what we were doing with Riverpod, how we could actually create our own classes. I want to hammer that point home and create a new class in here called home providers.dart. And essentially Riverpod class, and I'm going to call this home index. It's going to essentially track an integer. It'll start at 0, and what it will do is, if you want to say set value, value, it will take an int of the new value and essentially set the state to that. There we go. I have to do my build runner for all of this. I have to, once again, import Riverpod's annotation, and then I have to do the part. Otherwise, build runner will fail. So let's do that. Let's see if this actually works. I hope. All right, so same thing. This is what it starts with. This is what it accepts. And then I can put whatever extensions or whatever additional methods I want to modify the state only in that location, completely separating my UI from my state, which is a clean way to build things. So in here, I have a bottom navigation bar. It has a current index, and then it has this function called onTap. Those are the two things that I'm going to accept. So here, current, let's actually do current index is equal to ref.watch, and that's going to be home index provider. And I need to make this final. Current index is going to be whatever this current index is, and on tap will take a value and essentially go to ref.again read, because I'm in an async or button press, home index provider dot notifier, and I'm going to set the new value to whatever this thing is. So if I hit save and I click in between, there we go. I've essentially cleanly separated out my state. I can make these changes wherever I want. I can look at this in any other widget and figure out, am I on index 0, 1, or 2? And that's how I could essentially redraw different parts of this user interface. The last thing that I'm going to cover is we're going to actually add some more stuff into here. And if you look at this point, so what we have in this body, which is right here, we essentially have the image, and then I'm going to want to put everything just nice and small just right below it. And so essentially what I'm going to do a little bit lower, let's do stateless consumer. Let's do, I'll just call this selections. And I'm going to, instead of all of this, I'm going to put this in an expanded because I want it to take all of the space, and it's just going to have that selections. So this is going to be blank again until I put this with something else. And I'm going to put this with a wrap, and I'm going to put in here, instead of actually directly putting in all of them by hand, I can also do something like List.generate. And let's do 15 things that all say text. And you should see, if this updates, that looks terrible. So what we can do on here, I'm going to hover over, and I can say, oh, I need some spacing between all of this. So let's set some spacing to 12, and let's set some run spacing, which is in between one item to the next. Let's set that to 24 and see what that does. Okay. We can also align them, and it's giving me all of these examples, like it's essentially telling me what to do next, which is great. That's a really nice thing that you can do for this. And if the point of this is if I had 15 things or 150, I can still make this very quickly. There is absolutely no point in me handwriting all of those items for the 16 that you see that's there. Instead, I have these, and essentially all I would need to do is set up a stateless item. There we have. And what I would essentially take, I want to make it once so that it accepts everything and so that it looks nice and clean. What I can do inside of here is instead of this being text, I can make it where it's like within my widget, I can accept different values. So last part that I'm going to cover just in terms of timing. So final string text, final, we'll do icon data, icon, and final. And if you look at what some of these buttons will actually take, it's a function that returns nothing. That could be a null function, and it's on pressed. That's a common thing that you'll see in a lot of buttons. And if you're ever in like an outline button or any of the other widgets, you just hover over with your mouse and it'll show you exactly that. And that's all I'm just bringing into here. This tells me that I have to initialize all of my variables. And so I'm doing that. It wants to get rid of the key because this is a private, which makes sense. And if I hit save and I set this to item instead of this list, actually what I'll do is set this to items. Right now it's not doing anything because this is just a container. But if instead what I do is I put this inside an outlined button, and I need on pressed, which I just set. I need child, and I'll just do text with text, at least for the time being. And let's see if this actually updates. You can see this. It has all the different parts of text that we've set. And the last thing I want to do is I'm just going to wrap this with a column. I'm going to put in a gap. And I'm going to do that. And then I'll do an icon with the icon. So there's a lot of really cool ways that you can make this essentially look like whatever you would like. We can make this a little bit larger so that you see it. And essentially you can just build from there to make one aspect after the next after the next. This was 1 hour. I still have 6 minutes, and I got pretty close to there. The only things that remain is all I have to do is change the size of the text. I can add some animations, and I can add this last bit at the bottom. But I know we've covered a lot, and I've intentionally put a lot of this directly into that GitHub repo, as well as showing exactly what we did and where and why. So if you want to actually have animations in your application, it's really easy these days. You literally just say add a dependency, Flutter animations, or Flutter animate. And if you want this turtle, as a good example, to shake every time you, or we can do a shimmer. It has this nice little shimmer. Or, if I make it so that every time I click on it, I want it to actually shake, you can do that as well. And you can see that in the code that I have here. So you can have an angry turtle. And there's a lot of different really cool things that you can do with animations. And it's this simple these days. So with all of that in mind, kind of bringing it back, what we do is we connect a lot of things in Flutter into FHIR. FHIR is the healthcare data interoperability standard. It is a global standard that is all the way across the world, and we connected it to Flutter. So FHIR-FLI is a big thing that we're very proud of that we've built. Google has a thing called Open Health Stack, which if you're building in exclusively Android, you can use that. If you are building things in Flutter and you want to connect into healthcare data, I would suggest FHIR-FLI. This is 10 million lines of code, completely open source, MIT licensed. that have been used by developers in 7 countries. They've been extended upon by others, and that we use ourselves with the healthcare solutions that we build, and that we've gotten a number of recognitions for over the years. But really, that's essentially how you can get started with a Flutter application from the very beginning, all the way into bare bones, setting some aspect up from your actual widget folder structure, making the most of keyboard shortcuts in 2023. Just use them. If it's Android Studio or VS Code, just find a thing that works for you. If you are working with extensions, they can absolutely speed you up with all those snippets. And absolutely, the code generation that exists today is so much easier than it was when Flutter first went live in December 2018, for the better. So if you're just getting started, I'm very opinionated at this point, but you see what I'm doing for architecture and for state. Feel free to use that. If you find something that works differently for you, use that as well. But the nice thing about Flutter is you can just see everything happen in real time, and it's wonderful. So again, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm happy to answer any questions now, and certainly can go in depth on anything that we've discussed. Good question. So repeating why did I pick Flutter over other options? In my personal journey, so I was a scribe on paper when we had transitioned to an electronic health record. I was essentially over all of my med school, residency, fellowship, 26 years of education plus other things. I saw 20 health systems in different levels of electronic medical record adoption. And as a resident, I pitched a hackathon idea for a app to help care for patients whose heart had stopped, for medics in the pre-hospital space, and got the grand prize. Still in residency, sat down with an old friend who was a Java developer, and we built most of the application there. 2 years later, time broke my application, and I was trying to think through, am I sticking with Java? Do I go to Kotlin? It took several of us, it was 2 of us, it took us about 4 months to make the effort that we had gotten to. And that was literally December of 2018. Flutter went live December of 2018. And instead of it being 2 people in 4 months, it was me in 3 weeks to get to exactly the same spot where I was. And then I started giving live coding presentations at medical conferences and just fell in love with it. And so the ability to talk and type at the same time, thank you for bearing with that, is typically how I try to explain, at least for those in the medical perspective, the cool stuff about Flutter and why we think it's cool. At the beginning, it was, I press save and it changes, and that's great. You don't get that, or you didn't get that with a lot of the other development frameworks. Nowadays, you'll still see that, but the fact that everything is very declarative, it's a very open community, you have lots of examples that you can build from, and you can work on all 6 platforms, is why I still am very excited and love building things there. There's some things that maybe you shouldn't build in Flutter, and that's totally fine. Like if it's a very text-heavy, web-focused application, at least right now, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you need you need ownership of your screen, if you need something that is mobile first, if you need something that uses a lot of, that could work on very old phones, Flutter absolutely is a wonderful tool, and that's a large reason why developers love it. Yes. So 2 parts of that question. First is, do you have compatibility issues when you're working for Android, iOS, and other platforms? And can you tailor your user interface or layouts to the platform? And so first is you can actually set the target platform, and you can have adaptive user interfaces based on the target platform. You can also do that with a Flutter package called responsive, I think it's responsive UI, but ResoCoder made it. But essentially, you can set it for mobile size, tablet size, and desktop size, and you can set your own version of that. You can, if it's Android, show this. If it's iOS, show this. If it's web, show this. And then to the point of, are there issues on different platforms? When we were building a lot of things in FHIR-FLI and testing it, and often some of the things that we'll test are web first, for an Android phone and an iPhone, and then on a tablet, and then on somebody's computer. iOS, web, Safari, or Chrome had different ways that some of the values were stored. And so it was actually causing some challenges for one of the packages we had called FHIR-FLI, that we had to go way into the weeds, and you could only test it on a physical iOS device to get to it. That's rare. Most things you're going to build for in Flutter don't get anywhere near that. And you can definitely do adaptive layouts. You can do all sorts of other really powerful stuff. Just be mindful of what version of web that you're going to target, and if it makes sense if it's a web-first platform. Does the file get too bulky when you're targeting for these platforms? So, no, it's fine. Yeah, so the nice thing about not having to worry about a separate code base for Android and for iOS is you saw how I have this just like here at the very beginning. I can just have within a couple of lines, if Android show this, if iOS show that. So target platform, and that's it. So that bulkiness isn't something that you see. So Flutter is built on the Dart framework. And Dart, the reason why we love Dart and Flutter is because it has ahead of time and just-in-time development. Just-in-time is I press save and you see it update in real time. Ahead of time is when I'm fully done with it, it'll compile everything all the way down to machine code for Android and iOS and native desktop and Mac and Linux, which is really, really powerful. If you are debugging on an Android phone, your app is going to be about 400 megabytes. So it's huge. When you publish it, it could be 4 megabytes, which may be bigger than a native web application. But for an app on like an Android phone that you're downloading, it's small and fast. So the code amount that you would have to worry about if you're building specifically for Android or iOS is minuscule compared to if you were doing native Android and native iOS. And in terms of the amount that you have to manage, way less. Good question. Yeah.
I was just curious, what made you like want to get into the technology aspect of the health field? Because like you're doing all this, like what is like just it's all a personal question. So like,
Oh yeah, of course.
why against like I guess what is like the drive? Why is it that you're so like passionate about the tech aspect? You find like there's opportunities in the tech field. Why not just stick to developing versus like you still want to like be there in physical helping people in practices?
So for those that are online, why go towards tech, and why almost kind of balancing in between them? Why not just go straight into tech or straight into the other? And I think the whole point is here. Your interaction needs to mirror your workflow. And I could talk to you all day about what my last emergency medicine shift was. And as somebody who hasn't seen it, it's very different. This is where clinical informatics is huge, is because if you are practicing clinically as an informatician who, takes data, information, and knowledge to advance health and delivery of healthcare, you see something that is a little bit different than had I skipped out on the whole medical journey and did not practice clinically. And me observing a doctor in a department, in an emergency department, is not the same as me having to think through all of the different things that are buying my time and interrupting me over the course of an 8-hour shift. It's huge. Why the passion? I think we can do better. And if you look at where we are in healthcare, burnout is way high, often attributed to our electronic health records, because we have too many things that require our attention. And frankly, a lot of this stuff doesn't match our workflow, and we get pulled in all different directions. Burnout is extremely high in emergency medicine as compared to other specialties. So what I do on shift as an informatician is I try and help trainees be more efficient so that they're happier on shift. But I think we can do better in 2023. And my goal is to actually match the stuff that we're seeing. So my personal journey had started with a path of, we were always tinkered. My dad was a designer engineer. I built sonar parts for the Navy when I was a kid in our backyard. We built a robot when I was 17 for a STEM program in high school. And, we always built stuff. And one of the things we built, we got hung up on the user interface because everything was built in Visual Basic on a Windows ME machine, and we didn't know enough about Linux at the time. So that's kind of what pulled me towards design and usability to begin with. Then actually Human-Computer Interaction Lab from University of Maryland as a medical student is why I learned about usability and got super excited about that. And why medicine? I was heading towards medicine since probably I was 12. And I just am lucky to have had a lot of conviction that first doc in my family, I wanted to be a physician. Saw the emergency medicine experience a long time before, when I was in college and right after, as an EMT and a scribe and a tech. Loved emergency medicine, wasn't going to change at all. And then for informatics, I fixed computers in college, and then all this fun design and the things that you can just create from nothing is where I started going down that path. So it ultimately was a journey of 26 years of education and lots of travel and lots of training to get me where I am now. But I wouldn't change it at all because every aspect was a huge learning opportunity and allowed me to apply this in a manner that was incredibly useful and impactful, right? And so if I can make 15 physicians faster on shift, I think I'm doing a good job. If I can apply this for 1,000 patients, I think I'm doing a good job. And if we can build something that it's literally being used by 7 countries, that's awesome. And so, that same idea of Flutter, how it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and we built things that were open to help. That's the reason why I started teaching people about Flutter in healthcare conferences, is I wanted to expand that workforce of clinically focused, likely informaticians and technology developers and people that were in this space that wanted to do things better together. And so that was my journey. And thanks for letting me live code.